Hello, I'm Andrew Kamei-Deitch, and we're continuing our look at pre-modern Japan. Today we're going to be talking about the Kamakura period. Now, last time I talked a bit about warriors and the role that they came to have in Japanese society. Today we're going to consider how the political and social situation of Japan changed as a result of these warriors becoming more powerful. Now, when we talk about the Kamakura period, this is seen as Japan's early medieval era, and of course it is actually strongly associated with warriors and the Bakufu, the military government, at Kamakura. But actually, that's only part of the story, as we're going to see today. You'll notice that I didn't just call our talk the Kamakura Bakufu, I said the Kamakura Bakufu and the dual polity. What is a dual polity? Well, that's what we're going to be taking a look at. But let's start by talking about that military government a little bit. Now, the Kamakura Bakufu, so set up by Minamoto no Yoritomo, this took the place of the previous military-style government that had been organized briefly by Taira no Kiyomori. Now, essential to the Kamakura Bakufu was land control, and the Bakufu managed land through using two types of official. The first were shugo, and these were like military governors. They handled security matters, they suppressed rebellions, and they also dealt with criminal investigation. On the other hand, there were also jito, land overseers. These were officials who carried out tax collection duties and also land management and local police duties. Now, the structure of the Kamakura Bakufu consisted of three separate boards: the samurai dokoro, which handled military and police issues, the Monshujo, which was the board of inquiry, and that was where people went to when they had problems that they had to settle, so this was essentially the judicial issues branch. And then we had the Mandokoro, the board of administration, that handled general governance and policy. And of course, all three of these boards were supposed to be supervised by the shogun himself. Now, essential to this system was the idea of vassalage, which you might recall I talked a little bit about last time. Yoritomo and other military-style leaders had been ruling through networks of vassalage, and the system kind of works like this. You have a lord and a vassal. The vassal is supposed to offer loyalty and military service to his lord, and in exchange, he receives protection, rewards, land, and ranks. So, of course, there are other types of rewards as well, but land and ranks were the most predominant form that existed in this system. Now, vassalage relations were particularly important in early medieval society. They were like the glue that held that society together, and the family alliances and economic relations at the time strongly depended on these. Now, the other thing to remember is that these relations were actually seen as a type of transaction that were dependent upon both sides keeping the deal. So the image that we have in contemporary society of samurai being always loyal and always standing with their masters, this is a little bit of a romantic misconception that comes from later times. Actually, if it was seen that a lord was not keeping his word to his warriors, then his warriors would feel no need to remain loyal to him. Their loyalty was conditional on their master actually keeping his word to them. So the conceptions that we have today concerning this type of absolute loyalty, this is a much more modern concept that didn't actually describe the type of relations that samurai were engaged in this period. The other thing to remember is that vassalage relations were also counted on by the Bakufu. This was not just a means of social organization, it was also a means of political control. And therefore, the Bakufu had to consistently keep its word as sort of the ultimate lord, the shogun himself being kind of the lord of the realm, in order to retain the loyalty and service of all of the samurai. Now, the interesting thing is that we historians used to believe that the court, meanwhile, had ceased to be significant after 1185. So we have these warriors rise up and increasingly come to dominate society, and therefore we say, oh well, the tenno and the court are sort of out of the picture. From now on, it's all about the shogun and the warriors. But we now know that this is not quite correct. First of all, Yoritomo's legitimacy actually came from the tenno, so the tenno appointed him as shogun, and he drew upon that legitimacy and continued to operate within the court rank system. Now, this is not just something that happened symbolically. The court also remained a political, economic, and legal center of power in the early medieval era. So Yoritomo didn't really get rid of the old system, more like he was working within it and modifying it. So the best way that we can conceive of the socio-political system of Kamakura Japan is of one polity that has two distinct centers. On the one hand, we have the court in Kyoto, led by the retired sovereign, the inn. On the other hand, we have the Kamakura Bakufu, led by the shogun. And so collectively we call this the dual polity, and this, we believe, is the best way of understanding the sort of situation that we have in early medieval Japan. Now next I want to talk a bit about the Hojo Regency. This was an important part of the Kamakura Bakufu. Now, of course, this is Hojo Masako. You might remember from last time I briefly introduced her as Yoritomo's wife. Hojo Masako was later called the Nun Shogun. This was sort of an appellation she received because in her later years she took up the tonsure and became a nun. Now this of course did not mean that she retired from being someone who was politically active. In fact, it was quite common in Japanese society for elites to withdraw, in name at least, by taking up the position of a monk or a nun, and yet they remained engaged in that society. So they didn't sort of go away to the mountains and meditate quietly. That is the sort of a stereotype. In reality, they remained very much engaged with the world around them, even if they were a monk or a nun. Now, Hojo Masako was not just Yoritomo's wife, she was also the daughter of Hojo Tokimasa, who was a very powerful figure in the Bakufu. And Hojo Masako was someone who consistently worked to strengthen the Bakufu. She had a great belief in the institution and in what she thought was the best direction for that institution to evolve in. So, for example, when the second shogun, her son Yuri-ie, was seen as being rather headstrong and making brash decisions, she established a council of elders to try to balance out his power a little bit. And similarly, when it looked as if Sanetomo, the third shogun, was going to have a bit of a trouble establishing his legitimacy, she was prepared to challenge her own father to ensure that his position would be secure. Now, Sanetomo himself was assassinated in 1219, which was a bit of a problem because this meant that there were no more descendants of Yoritomo to become the shogun. So, the next two shoguns were taken from the Kujo family, which was one of the major regent families in Kyoto. And the rest of the Kamakura shoguns, namely numbers 6 through 9, were actually royal princes. So this development shows a strong connection between the court and the Bakufu. We have, again, a tendency in the modern world to think about warriors and courtiers as being completely separate groups of people, but the reality was in the early medieval era there was a lot of overlap between these categories, and the fact that the last set of shoguns themselves hailed from the royal family gives us sort of a sense of how close those relations really were. So here we have our little family tree, the genealogy of early Kamakura shoguns. You can see that we have the first shogun, the Minamoto no Yoritomo, right there in the middle. And then, of course, the second shogun, his son Yuri-ie, followed by Sanetomo. And then for the fourth shogun, we go all the way down to the bottom here with Kujo Yoritsune. He, of course, was the son of Kujo Michie and Saionji Rinshi. Now, I already mentioned that the Kujo family were, of course, a powerful regent family in Kyoto. The Saionji were also a very influential courtier family. So Kujo Yoritsune had a very strong background coming from the court. And, of course, after him, Kujo Yoritsugu became the following shogun. So this sort of just gives us a sense of how strong those connections were between the court and the Bakufu, that the shoguns themselves were sort of shipped over from Kyoto when they ran out of direct descendants of Yoritomo. Now, as time went by, the position of the shogun itself became increasingly weak, and rather than the shogun, it became the head of the Hojo family who came to hold the most power in Kamakura. So this is a person who came to be known as the Hojo regent. Now, basically what happened was the regent would run the bakufu while the shogun acted as a ceremonial figure. And you might remember we've seen this type of pattern before in pre-modern Japan. Recall that we had the tenno versus the retired sovereign, right? Where one of the tenno sort of steps down and then from behind the scenes continues to hold real power as the in. Well, the tenno carries out the kind of ceremonial duties of rulership. Well, it was a similar type of relationship that we have going on here. You might even be reminded of the relationship between the Heian era tenno and the regent at the time. So, how is this enforced? Well, we have this structure of how the Hojo Regency was set up. You can see that we have the shogun at the top and those boards at the bottom that I mentioned earlier. And then we have this board of counselors that's acting as a group of administrators in the middle. And then these new little categories in the middle, we have the regent and the co-signer were inserted. Of course, the regent was the one with the most power, and both positions were hereditary posts of the Hojo family. So from this point on, the Hojo family became cemented as the main decision makers in Kamakura, while the shogun continued to be more and more a ceremonial position. So, in conclusion, a couple of points we should draw out here. First of all, Yoritomo did not replace the old court system, but just like Kiyomori, he kind of worked within the existing system. And second, if we think about the Kamakura period, we see the emergence of this kind of synthetic polity, where it's partly based in the court, partly based in the bakufu. There's a lot of negotiation and responsibility sharing between these two kind of separate chunks of government within the same polity. We've got the court being led by the retired sovereign, and the bakufu being led by at first the shogun, and later the Hojo regent. Thank you very much.